Welcome to the East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the East Angle. This time we have quite an interesting setup because this is the first time we have invited one of our brilliant students to the podcast, and I will hand over to Ra to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Sherzod. So today we are indeed lucky enough to have with us Anastassia Melnikov, who has been here learning international relations for the last...
undergraduate level?
At
or
postgraduate level.
Postgraduate level. Master's level, yeah.
So I think the first thing we want to say is welcome, Anastasia, and tell us your story. Why are you here? Where have you come from? How have you got to UEA?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Lots of questions, right? Well, long story short, I am at UEA for my postgraduate work. I did study undergrad in the U.S. In Florida, did international studies and journalism with a minor in literature. Before that, we moved around a lot. Sherzod and I actually share a bit of ancestry in Uzbekistan. My father's from there. He's Ukrainian. Long story because nobody's ever just from one place. And then my mom is German from Siberia. So long story short, born, exiled, worked in Central Asia, moved to the U.S. for undergrad education, and now I'm here at UEA expanding myself further.
Because we do call this, we say it's an amazing story, and we call this East Angle, we say it's the East broadly defined. That is very broadly defined.
Yes.
I'm thinking German-Siberian, that's quite an unusual combination. So if you don't mind me asking, how come did your mum end up being a German in Siberia?
So this goes back to Ekaterina I, where she was a German princess that married a Russian Tsar, and she saw that Russia had so much land and so much opportunity, so she invited Germans to come and help basically be part of the community, also earn some land. And from what my mom, I actually had to ask her more about this, but they had German autonomy. At that time, they were settled in Volga initially, but since the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and of course specifically World War II, being German was quite intimidating and terrifying to the Russian population. So they were placed into Siberia. And it's such a sad story. Like I always encourage people to ask more about your parents, where they came from, what their histories are, because I learned that my grandmother is one of 11 children. When she was just a baby, they were placed in Siberia, but the way they were placed in Siberia is, here's land, figure out how to survive.
That was the way that it was done, both, of course, in the old days, but also in Stalinist times when people were just, you know the story of the kulaks, the class enemies who were usually the rich peasants who had, who worked very hard, who had usually big families, and who were just moved usually within a few hours. Didn't have much time to grab their belongings, and they were put on trains.
Suitcase.
Yeah, if that. Yeah, and then just landed in the taken to somewhere in the east, like in the middle of nowhere, and then just left there. Lots of people died, unfortunately. So, what Anastasia is talking about, the Germans, in a similar way that the Japanese invited, Oyatoi Gaikokujin in Catherine the Great's time. There were lots of German specialists, not just, very high-ranking ones, like high-ranking military people came. People came from Eastern Prussia a lot. Lots of Eastern Prussians actually played a big part in Russian society. And then, of course, when, especially in the 30s, when Nazi Germany and Soviet Union were kind of, it was expected they would face off at some point. They came under pressure with the Great Terror.
And does that still live on to this day, that legacy? So is there still this situation, like say, for example, for your mum or others, is there this almost enclave or ethnic minority of Germans in Siberia or across Russia who are still facing a certain kind of discrimination or a certain kind of disadvantage because of that history? Or is that kind of consigned to history now?
It's hard to tell. I'd have to ask my mom more about that because my entire family actually moved to Germany, back to Germany. Part of it was because a lot of their wealth was stolen. They struggled quite a bit, but the farm or the dacha that where I would visit when I was younger was basically the entire family. It was all extended family. It was all kind of our family that created this little village.
And they're Russian now. Completely.
Well, no, they're German.
Oh, they're
Because back in Germany.
Oh, I see what you mean. Right? Yeah.
So they're back in Germany. But at that time, and I always ask my mom because my mom and my dad have very different experiences of living in Russia during the Soviet Union. My mom does share that she was provided full education, employment, and not that she was ignorant, but in a way she was ignorant to what was going on politically because she had concerns, family to take care of, education to acquire, and my dad's is very different experience. He was very critical of the Soviet Union. He was in jail because he spoke against it. He spoke against the gulags. He was a journalist, photographer. So my mom always reminded me there was this acknowledgement of they were Germans. They weren't Russians, but she shares that she felt more in her, as she grew up, there was more inclusion of some sort. But it could also be where you are. I mean, Russia's an enormous place.
Soviet Union was even bigger than Russia. So in those days, a lot of the Germans ended up in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is an interesting case. There's been some great research actually on Kazakhstan by Western scholars. Kazakhstan as being this, some American historians have compared Kazakhstan to the Wild West because lots of empty space. Some have compared it to Australia because it was this kind of penal colony because lots of people, lots of ethnicities like Chechens, for example, or like Crimean Tatars, like Germans, the ethnicities that were seen as recalcitrant, that were seen as inconvenient for Stalin's regime would be moved to Kazakhstan. There were some notorious camps. There was this one camp called Algier. Algier actually in Russian sounds exactly as Algeria. Has nothing to do with Algeria. It's an abbreviation of a camp. Akmolinski лагерь жен изменников Родины. Akmola camp for the wives of the enemies of or traitors of the motherland, where wives of everybody who was kind of repressed, either shot or sent into the gulag in the 30s would be sent. So Kazakhstan became this kind of, on one hand, it's this very kind of Soviet idea of virgin lands. Let's build this paradise in the steppe. On the other hand, it's kind of this horrible place where all this penal colony. And lots of Germans were, don't let me dominate your story, Nastya, but I hope you don't mind me calling Nastya, which is like the diminutive, like Russian typical way of addressing women with the name Anastasia.
Education of its own.
But I just remember the story. I had a classmate, and I come from Uzbekistan, not Kazakhstan, but not too far. I had a classmate who actually had a German name. The name was Bolgert. I don't know if the German original is Bolhert or whatever, but I remember kids can be cruel. And looking back, for me, this is kind of a very stark manifestation of Soviet ideology, anti-German ideology, which dates back to the Second World War. Anytime that poor kid, had a fight with anyone, people would call him a fascist.
Right, yeah.
And kids would call him a fascist, that you're not one of us, you're a fascist. And I can only imagine the trauma that caused that guy.
The self-censorship that they had to maintain.
And you think the kids in Norwich complain about being called chav or numpty. That's crazy.
Well, it's also bad in its own way, but you get that. So I'd like to ask you about UEA a bit more, about Norwich.
We never heard the story actually why you chose UEA.
So UEA, I'm sure Anastasia chose UEA
because it's the best university.
It's the best university. It's a brilliant university with lots of interdisciplinarity, lots of diversity, lots of people like both faculty and students who share lots of different interests, and that you found something like that and came here. But don't let us speak for you. Tell us why you found UEA interesting and having come here, do you think that you were right to choose this place?
Or was it a terrible mistake?
Well, Ron. No, UEA, I speak of UEA with so much just love and affection, and partly because when I went to undergrad, there was a little bit, my family's a little Asian in that how they didn't want me to achieve greatness and make sure that I get the most out of education, which is why we went to the US for education. Before that, I was homeschooled. If I did go to school, it would be for like a month or two because we traveled and worked so much. So when we went to the US, there was this pressure to like journalism is truly a wonderful career. It is insightful, especially for a woman. I was the eldest daughter. It would open up doors for me. But we had a very international life. We had a very dynamic and traveling experience. So I kind of started with journalism and then I added on international relations because I got to see some perspectives that I didn't know. Forwarding to UEA, couple years, many years that I will not name the number of years passed, and I knew I wanted to go back into school. I love academia, I love research, I love reading, and I just had a very unconventional upbringing and career as I was younger, so I couldn't really find a way. I didn't know how I fit into the structure that was in the US, kind of you go to school, you start work, and I wanted to get back to academia because I always did. I mean, I love education. It's such a privilege, and I think that's one of the things, just a bit of a side note, I think it's one of the things that a lot of people from the Western cultures don't realize. It is a huge privilege to have access to education, not just university level, but even regular school.
We need to get Anastasia to preach in class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But,
Sorry,
but it's true. It's true. We've traveled. I spent a lot of time in Nepal, and I remember the last time we went a couple years ago, I had terrible jet lag where I was waking up at 5 in the morning and I would just sit in the window and watch the sunrise. And there was this school across the kind of yard, so to speak. And I would watch little kids go to school and they were so excited. They were so happy to go to school. They had the structure. So to me, it was always a privilege. And I knew that this was a privilege I've been given. So thinking about my postgrad, I really want to go back into international relations. I knew that much, but I wanted to make sure that if I'm studying international relationships, I'm approaching it from an international perspective. So continuing that in the US just didn't seem open enough. I needed to take a step back and really explore. So my brother studies here, economics. He helped me kind of look at all the universities in England because England and UEA in particular, they are decolonizing the academia, which to me is very interesting and very important for us to do. So UEA caught my attention, and he spoke very highly of it. He spoke a lot about his professor, so I put UEA to the test. I put it to the test.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that's just so interesting, right? Because to me, to my mind, US education, particularly in decent schools in the States, is very internationalized in a lot of ways, and we could make the argument, right, that the United States is currently the most powerful actor in the international system. Wouldn't it make sense to stay in the US and learn international relations? And I also find it fascinating that the EDI issues were
DEI.
Sorry,
if you use the American abbreviation, which is the same. Which let's for the readers, diversity, equality, and inclusion, or in the UK it's equity, diversity, and inclusion or inclusivity. Some people, the word that I hate. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, what is it that you wouldn't get? Just to play devil's advocate, what is it that you wouldn't get in the US that you feel that you are experiencing in a UK educational environment in that sense?
I think for me personally, in the US, even though there is this acknowledgement of the movement to inclusion and decolonization of academia and just the workforce in general, it's still at early stages. I think in the US, the intention is there, but I think with how the political things are going right now, it might even not only take a back burner, but almost completely disappear, unfortunately. So in the UK always to me seemed like a leader in climate change initiatives, in sustainability. So I think there's a sense of responsibility to, if we're going to say we're going to do this, we're going to do this.
Right.
Oh, go on. Sorry.
No, but
ultimately, I was going to ask, why is decolonization, before we move on to other subjects, why is decolonization important in general, but also specifically to you? I mean, taking a cue from your answer about UK being, I mean, we can go back and ask why. I mean, I will ask you, why do you think UK is more open to these ideas, or why you think UK is more open? But then before that, like, why is decolonization so important?
Well, let's put it this way. There is a
Decolonizing the curriculum, maybe. Yeah.
Well, not just the curriculum. It should apply in general to how we perceive and how we talk to people, but especially the curriculum, because a lot of the scholars, especially in IR, are Western scholars. And that's great and all, but it's just one perspective.
Sure.
It might be, and it's this kind of push that they have all the answers. It's a very patriarchal way of looking at, we know how the world works, how it should work. The same you can apply to democratization, which I'm all for democracy, but if we approach anything from, let me tell you how it should be, that's not going to work. Same with development, climate change. Right now we need to address the climate issues, but we have to understand why the global south is coming at it the way it is. They haven't had the chance to develop as much as the global north has.
Right.
So do they have a say? Absolutely, they do. They do have a say.
But you think they're going to get less of a say now? You mentioned that, you know, what's changing in the United States, potentially that things could actually be retracting or regressing. Do you see that as just a blip while the Trump administration is in power, or do you think this is something like, do you get a sense? Because you are also an American citizen, I understand. So, I mean, living in the United States, do you fear that there could be this seismic shift that is massively conservative and takes the United States in a completely anti-progressive direction? Or is it just Trump's mini bubble?
To add to the American citizen, I am an American citizen, but I'm also a citizen of the world.
Brilliant.
But truly, I think it's important to remember, because right now nationalism has become such a big movement in the U.S. We see that with Modi in India. It's important to try and understand why that's happening, because it's not just, we can say, oh, they're being intolerable, but the same is being said about any side.
Right.
So we have to understand why these things are happening. I have a very pessimistic and a very optimistic side.
Okay, let's hear both of them.
The optimistic is, I do believe I've gotten to see the world. I've recognized the privilege I've had in being able to see the world as I have, and I'm glad that as a child I didn't realize this privilege. It was, you are in this community, you're in this society, you have to embrace it. You have to understand, talk to people, and learn about them, because there's beauty in it. Part of why we lived in Uzbekistan, it is an ancient and beautiful culture that people don't realize. There's one of the
I've been
oldest
telling you,
cities
Ram.
somewhere
I've been
around.
telling you over the years.
I'm going. I'm going.
You should. But it's a beautiful, beautiful place that I don't feel like they know enough about. Some of the most interesting poets and philosophers, Navai, a prime one that people just must know and read, absolutely, people wouldn't know about it. So talk about decolonizing academia. Navai should be taught as a philosopher, not just Hobbes, or they're all great philosophers. It doesn't demean them, but it's an introduction. It's an addition to what we already have.
To be fair, there's been some very good podcasts lately. I mean, I would recommend the Empire podcast which is hosted by William Dalrymple and Anita Anand, which is absolutely brilliant, like the episodes on Babur especially. And William Dalrymple is an expert on Babur. I mean, he wrote the foreword to Babur Nama, English translation. So, again, I agree with what Anastasia is saying. Absolutely, you know, we need to bring in other perspectives into this study. I mean, I still want to get back to you on the importance
because I keep going off topic.
No, it's not because of that. I just want to kind of really, I'm really curious. Decolonizing curriculum is a very controversial subject. I mean, especially a couple of years ago when the whole BLM movement was all the rage in the US. It was so, at some point it took over all the news media to an extent that people forgot about COVID briefly. In this country, it led to some statues being toppled, and, you know, all the other kind of unedifying things that were going on in society. I'm just curious about your own perspective. Why is it important for us, especially, I mean, the DEI thing is now being, which you can see how Trump and his administration is treating DEI is kind of a backlash, a conservative backlash. But why is it important for us specifically? I mean, I'm asking you as a UEA student, and I'm really curious always to know what our students think about this, what the new generations think about the direction of the world. Why is decolonizing the curriculum so important?
Well, because of the different perspectives, right? That you just
Well,
talked
not
about.
just that. Like, Rod, you have all the. You are my professor.
I don't have any of the answers.
but
Not just all of them, any of them.
But that's. I think that's
Well,
the
we
reason.
learn from our students. Yeah,
We do.
Aw,
sometimes.
It's true.
Yeah.
We do.
Yeah.
this one excluded from the conversation.
Not at all.
No, but I think that's part of it is because the world has made great progress. We've made great evolutions in how globally we communicate with each other. I think if we look, things are better, but we can't ignore the fact that they're not perfect. And I'm not talking about a utopian world where everybody's happy. That would be ideal. The optimist in me hopes that we can all get along and appreciate the various cultures and opinions, views, and histories we have, good and bad. The pessimist in me sees that things are not working out. They're kind of breaking down quite a bit. And so as much as I would love to think that Trump's administration is a temporary solution, attempt of a solution to what's going on in the world, I think we have to look deeper at why are people so miserable? Why are people feeling that this is the answer? So part of decolonization of academia is that we need to stop thinking so narrowly. We look at from historically how we've learned about what democracy versus communism, for example. There's always been this dialogue about democracy good, communism bad, and I'm not questioning that. But we have to understand, okay, what's the perspective from that side? We don't have to agree to entertain or even ask more clarification of why was this a fight from both sides? Why was this such an important thing that both sides felt right to fight for?
Sure. I mean, are we not also, though, seeing an environment where economics is increasingly dominating?
Oh,
this,
absolutely.
right?
It's the new religion.
Right, it's the new
Money's
religion,
the new
right?
religion.
And it's spoken about as if it's an absolute truth. And I wonder if what we're partly seeing at the moment, particularly thinking of this from the East perspective, when you look at Far Eastern economies, is an acceptance that there's going to be a reversal to the sort of hyper-globalization that we've seen, and that actually nationalism is the new religion of economics as well. You know, it's not just a political ideology, it's a way of basically executing protectionism, you know, and that's how it's being understood.
Especially now with all the tariffs being
right, yeah,
announced
and that's just a
week.
massive accelerator, right?
Yeah.
But we're talking about potentially the end of a global economic system in terms of, you know, a system which had all these integrated, globalized supply chain. Of course, they're not going to die out overnight, but a very important step in completely rearranging the economic architecture, but not one that is going to challenge that basic fundamental idea of nationalism as the
From a historic viewpoint, I would actually maybe kind of, I mean, I don't know, like I would say things have happened in the past which have been quite as bad. Maybe not, I mean, we still have to wait and see. I mean, in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s, there were economic wars between even allies. So it's not unprecedented. You know very well the story of Japan and the US.
Of course, yeah.
You know, the realignments, massive realignments happening. So everybody was surprised by Trump kind of reaching out to Russia. But it wasn't unusual in 1971 for Nixon to reach out to China. So again, you know, from a historic viewpoint, a lot of what's happening today doesn't seem so stark as some media will want to portray it.
Sure,
but at the same time, I agree with maybe this has a potential. This has a potential to
be on that level, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, with the Nixon shock and also the Volcker shock, right? These are things that took place as a reaction to the United States feeling that its hegemony was threatened in the 1970s because it had become a deficit nation, you know.
Yeah.
And there's clearly an attempt to rectify that by the United States. I mean, empires, you mentioned empires. Empires generally try and sustain themselves. That's what they do. And so I think this is, like you say, not unprecedented, but it's quite stark. And it's maybe the end of a period that we've understood. And what I think people tend to sort of misgauge slightly is that it's not the case that you have Republicans, and sometimes in the case of Trump, an extreme Republican president that comes in and changes this. Democrat presidents tend to continue it, right?
Yeah.
sometimes even intensify it. It's not like Carter came in and changed everything. And it's similarly not the case that Biden came in after Trump and actually readjusted everything.
Well, both, interestingly, one-term presidents,
Right.
Carter and Biden. So on that, after following that kind of exchange between Ra and I want to ask you, because you are a student of international relations, you also said that you're taking some modules in politics and media at the UEA, and you are also a child of a very similar kind of moment in history from which I come. And it's. Do you find it as interesting as I do, in the sense that what we've discussed with Ran now, the return of nationalism, wasn't something when we were children, when the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody was celebrating. People like Fukuyama and people like, I don't remember the name, Krauthammer, were writing about the unipolar moment. The US is going to dominate the world. Not even like 30 years have passed. I mean, just over 30 years have passed since then. And then you see US basically just kind of almost on the brink of self-destruction. How do you view it, both as a student of international relations and as someone who's spent a lot of time in the US, among other places?
How do I view it? I think I view it with more questions than answers. I think that's part of the education, which I'll piggyback on why I chose UEA on
Right.
that.
This is the moment to shine.
This is the moment. This is the moment.
To demonstrate what you've learned at the UEA.
Absolutely. But it was important to me because I think we all look thinking we have answers, especially the younger generation. I think we sometimes look at this as saying, oh, we know why things are happening because we're learning about that. We're getting the information passed down to us from family, teachers, community. And you hear so many conversations of people saying, well, we should do this, or this is a solution. And my question is more, is it? Or is this just a repetition? So part of why I chose UEA was I reached out to a lot of professors beforehand, and it was a school that had all the professors I reached out to answer. And I actually came to see you weeks before the semester even started. But at no point at UEA did I have a professor give me, these are the solutions, these are the answers. The process has so far been to ask me back the questions. And that's been what I've been craving for in academia, because we need to stop thinking like we have answers. A lot of things are repeating. There's a lot of ripples in history, but also I think we're just looking at it very differently. I recently read, I won't remember the book, but I know Jarvis was one of the authors, about we look at security from a rationalist perspective as all the actors are rational, but is it the politicians that are the leaders? Is it the governmental bureaucratic system? Or is it the state as a whole? And I think that's still narrow. It's good that we're starting to expand, but part of the expansion is that we're asking more questions and we're looking at it. To one degree, the world hasn't gotten worse, because we can recall certain historic events that have been horrifying over the past 20, 30, 40, 50, keep going years. But there are things that have improved, that have gotten better. And I think my belief is part of the biggest problems is that we don't communicate enough. We don't try to understand each other enough. We went back to Asia after the U.S. because that was home. That's where we felt. And I was telling both of you earlier, the respect for elders concept in the West is very non-existent.
Non-existent. And we said, I mean, in the UK, it's
and
really non-existent.
I salute that, if you ask me.
But it's true. There's a value to respecting elders, especially as the oldest person in this room.
We all respect you, Ralph.
Thank you.
But not blind respect. It's just understanding. My mom and I have very different views on politics. So do my father and I. They both have very different views from themselves. But I respect their experience. I respect that they've gone through this, and I respect the history that they've went through, that they robbed me of by giving me a better life. So they've given me much more opportunity and removed certain experiences that they went through. So that kind of respect is what I'm talking about. It's not like, no,
I get it. But I'm just thinking as well, because you mentioned, or we were talking about the importance of economics. And in East Asia, there's a dual focus, sometimes seemingly contradictory, but not always, on economic advancement. You see it deeply ingrained in Chinese society, Korean society, Japanese society. most other East Asian societies, if I'm honest, and at the same time this somewhat almost Confucian-esque, respect for elders. So do you think that is it the case that actually the fact we mentioned that economics money is the new religion, is that not going to have a broader cultural impact? If we're thinking of the United States in decline, China's rising, it's the Asian century still, is that going to be relevant then going forward?
I think it's going to require balance, because economics, I could do what Susan Strange would absolutely hit me over the head over saying that capitalism is the reason for all our issues because of the way it's become very risk prone, the bigger risks, the bigger rewards, and regardless of who it penalizes. But I remember I took a friend of mine to Japan because I spent some of my teen years there as well. And I want to show him because I absolutely love the culture, and I think there needs to be a healthy recognition of Japanese culture and also admiration for it, because he was fascinated. He was like, there's a massive high-rise and a shrine on the same road. And I think that kind of balance, because what's the alternative? It's easy to criticize capitalism. It's easy to criticize democracy. It's easy to criticize anything that we have in place.
Do we have capitalism? Do we have capitalism in place?
Where? In Japan?
In the world. In the current system. Is the United States, is that capitalism? Or is that some kind of strange...
Well, exactly. Today...
corporate cronyism?
Today, very interestingly, in response to the tariffs and in response to Trump's some aggressive rhetoric, specifically against China, the Twitter account of, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese embassy in the U.S., actually posted a video of Ronald Reagan talking about free trade. I think that was kind of a very, very smart way to respond to Trump in many ways. And I do get the irony in Ra's question, like, do we really even have capitalism? Can we even call it capitalism? Or can we even call it free trade? The whole thing, the whole edifice, the whole Western civilization, if you want to call it. Obviously, that goes back to some earlier periods, but the whole kind of the combination of, if you like, the Fukuyaman neoliberalism or Western liberalism, which is kind of steeped in the ancient, the classic world of Roman Greece, and then, of course, goes back to Hegel on one hand in terms of political philosophy, but on the other hand, economically goes back to the idea of free trade, Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, the whole idea of the American Colossus that was built in the second half of the, Henry Brandt is the historian who wrote the book American Colossus, which is about how America rebuilt itself after the Civil War, and without even noticing it itself became the greatest economic power in the world, even before British Empire realized that. But even British Empire itself was solely built on this idea of free trade, especially if it benefited the West. When it didn't benefit it didn't matter if it didn't benefit places like China.
Right? Exactly. The Opium Wars. That's
Opium
not
Wars.
Free trade.
This is free trade for us. Like, if you don't want to trade with us, we will do it in an unfree way to you, but it will have to be free for us, kind of thing.
Conditional free trade, but it's violence. It's just a monopoly on violence, really, right?
In a way, but on the other hand, yes. And you know this very well from history. East Asian cultures have always been kind of a little bit uneasy about this rampant capitalism. In the 30s, for example, the Japanese rebellion, if you like, against the West, which led Japan to some really bad things happening in the late 30s and in the 40s with the war, was this distaste for capitalist excesses. Both among, you will be surprised, both among, Japanese Marxists, yes, you would expect that, but Japanese Marxists were pretty much, their movement had been beheaded by that time. But even among the right-wing Japanese nationalists, capitalism never found a very good, reaction or response. Yeah. So, which leads me, I don't know where I'm taking you with this, but I don't know. Maybe we can.
I'm curious to know. Listening to all this, Anastasia, because we in class we debate realism and liberalism and so on. And liberalism we always seem to bash, right? Because it's easy to bash. But is that because it's just got so many flaws? Is it not actually what we should be aiming for? I mean, is what you're saying in a way that, or could it be what we need to say is that capitalism is the answer, but it has to be a truer capitalism rather than,
Well, what is
cronyism.
without flaws?
Right.
Like what even democracy, we talk about how we can criticize democracy. It has flaws, but would we prefer authoritarianism? And I know I've listened to a podcast recently that said majority of younger citizens actually wish that it was a more authoritarian state.
Yeah, 27% in the UK. There's even a poll which said 27% of young people in the UK who were polled actually want an authoritarian leader. Or even like a benevolent dictator, if you like. Yeah.
Well, a benevolent dictator. Sorry, but that just sounds so
oxymoronic.
Absolutely,
Yeah, right.
absolutely.
If not moronic.
If not just outright moronic. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, on that note, let's take a break, after which we will ask Anastasia about her experiences in Japan.
Sure.
Okay, back from the break. Anastasia, you mentioned that you were in Japan for some time, so tell us about that. We usually ask anybody who has anything to do with Japan about their most brilliant experiences in Japan or most horrible experiences in Japan. I mean, we will let you speak whatever you want to tell us about Japan and your experiences in Japan.
Weird, horrible, interesting experience. Oh, I have a very interesting experience. My dad's Ukrainian, my mom's German. We also are not, there's some Kazakh, some Chinese on my dad's side as well. Very mixed cultures. But there was one time I was in Japan and I went into a Shinto shrine because I was sharing with my friend about Shinto. I absolutely thought it was very interesting how the religion evolved. Anyways, and I knew my Japanese is very rusty at this point, so I will not embarrass myself anymore, but I knew enough to
Probably
have
better than mine.
Conversations.
Okay, just kidding.
But
Go on.
the store owner started talking to me, and I responded, and I realized, I'm like, okay, there's some words I'm just not picking up, and he was like, oh, you're not Japanese, and I was like, wait a second. That's never happened to me.
Yeah, right.
I thought part of it was because blonde hair, and of course that they dye their hairs like anybody else does, but I realized years later, I was like, I think it's because what I've always tried to do, and I don't think it's any more intentional, is try to fit in within the culture and society. I love traveling. I love the different cultures. I think it's beautiful what various places have. So I tried to fit in as much as I can. But that was very pleasantly surprising to me because I do think it's a culture of respect.
Do you think she was joking or she was pulling your leg or something? Like, why do you
Well,
think...
I didn't think of that. No.
That's a slightly backhanded compliment. Yeah, I think that's pretty the highest possible compliment, right?
Yeah. Good. It
Yeah,
felt very good.
There you go. That's what I said. That's why I said your Japanese is better than mine.
Weird experiences. I did not.
Yeah.
I weirdly remembered my way around Tokyo when we went there, and especially the train stations. And this was a weird experience, but I love telling it. I always say Japan's very clean, even in Tokyo, and very respectful culture, of course. Every culture has problems, so we're going to focus on the positives. And my friend at the time that I was showing around Japan, I was buying the tickets, and he's just staring at the ground there. And I was like, you ready to go? He's like, no, I want to wait for a second. I was like, okay, let's wait. And what he later told me was that somebody dropped about 5,000 yen on the floor.
Right.
And I was just laying there, and he was watching to see who's going to pick it up. Nobody touched it.
Right.
People just kept walking by, and then finally you could tell somebody, the owner of the money, was just, oh, thank God it's there, picked it up. And the reason I like telling that story is because we have certain judgments of places. We have judgments about Middle East, Central Asia Karimov is a great example of how people sometimes criticize Uzbekistan without thinking about the people and what they experience. And so to me, these little stories of experiences, like they truly show there's so much more to a culture than what we sometimes, and especially in IR, because we look from a state level.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
look at the politicians as the representatives of the culture, but that's just.
That's why you should study history instead of.
Well,
I do love
yeah.
history,
but what I'm really curious to know is if you dropped a 5,000 yen or whatever it would be, a $50 note in Tashkent, would people stand around and wait for the owner to pick it up?
No.
I don't think they will. I think there is a traditional thing. I think this is Islamic. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. Maybe it's Uzbek. But when you find money, you are supposed to shout 3 times. Who dropped the money?
Yes.
Who dropped the money? And then, obviously, you don't just hand it over to anyone who said, I dropped it.
Yeah.
So normally if it's like several banknotes, you ask them, okay, how much was it? Like exactly.
Right.
If that person can tell, or if they do tell you it was this much, then you ask, okay, was it in like 20s? Was it in 50s? Just so you make sure that it's their money, and then you hand it over
But
to
it kind
them.
of goes to what we were saying about Asia's response to capitalism, as there's a bit of a fear of like when you're so money hungry and you're so about making financial gains, it almost takes away from those things that are inherently part of your societal, cultural.
I do always find it challenging in Japan. I mean, I say challenging. I find it puzzling because on the one hand, you actually have an extremely capitalist society in some ways. That's to say, for example, social welfare. I used to work in the city office in Japan and have to negotiate for citizens who had Japanese citizenship but couldn't speak Japanese. They come from the Philippines usually or somewhere else in Southeast Asia. And like the challenges they faced to try and get absolute basic welfare were pretty surprising. I mean, talking about having to sell your TV, sell your car,
Yeah, without the language, it's really hard.
But you're in a position where if you're not absolutely on your knees financially, you will not get assistance from the state. And that's very capitalist. But then on the other hand, there is a sense in which in Japan, people don't show off their wealth, generally speaking, as much. And bosses will take care of their workers more. They will try and look out for them, make sure they're kind of cared for. So it's a strange combination of, on the one hand, quite extreme focus on economic advancement, and on the other hand, a certain kind of socialism.
That's part of kind of capitalism. Is at my job in the U.S. before I went back to school, there was this massive push of not just the DEI, but just mental health awareness, because I think UK recognized the need for it much earlier. In the US, it was still up and coming, and I was in middle leadership, mid-management position, and it was something that was very pushed on us, like, you have to promote work-life balance. I'm like, I don't have work-life balance. How am I supposed to promote that? But there's this desire to have it because money is not the answer to everything, but it helps with a lot of things. So how do you balance the two? It's funny that we still struggle with that.
That could be, actually, that I should be careful what I say here. I think that might be a philosophy of some of our esteemed colleagues, shall we say?
Well, which is not a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing. And, in Japan, too, as you mentioned, money is... people don't like to show it off, but also people also have kind of in general, especially now with the yen being quite low, quite cheap. People's earnings are dwindling, especially if you work with if you want to travel abroad or something. But what struck me this week when they announced the statistics of the Japanese leadership, I mean the earnings and also the holdings of say the prime minister, I was really struck that the prime minister has only about $100,000 in his bank account. This is the prime minister of...
But that is his bank account that he publicly disclosed.
Okay, yes. I mean, I understand all of that. But then the richest guy in Japanese politics, Aso Taro, he... I mean, again, you will say the same thing, but in his account, he only has about $4 million.
But even his actual wealth is a pittance compared to the likes of Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly.
Or even Donald Trump or whatever.
Or even, some other people in US politics who are not maybe necessarily presidents or at that level. But
although you'll be surprised to learn that small Japanese business owners are extremely wealthy relative to both their staff and to others in equivalent positions in other countries. And that's partly to do with just the way the tax system is arranged. I only know that because I worked for a small company, and over beer and sushi we found out like kind of salaries and income streams. And
Some karaoke too.
it was actually explained to me how money was channeled. So small business, that's why there's so many as well. There are so many small and medium-sized businesses in Japan. So it's an interesting anomaly. But yeah, I take the point, right? I mean, you don't get as many multi-billionaires dominating the wealth in
which
Japan.
is more of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it will be controversial, but I'm with those people who say that. I mean, we don't why do we need so many billion? I mean, don't stop them. Don't do what Stalin did to the millionaires.
But what are you going to do with all them?
But on the other hand, why not? Why shouldn't rich people pay more tax? I mean, this is something that's apparently, a lot of even some conservative people are realizing that this is the only way out of this current crisis. Lots of millionaires in the UK, I don't remember what the organization is called, but something millionaires, like good millionaires, whatever. They're saying, actually tax us. We don't care. We will give that money away anyway. We will give it to charity. So,
Good millionaires. I'd love to hear from the bad millionaires.
bad millionaires usually don't
do.
speak. Yeah, don't quote me on that. It's not good millionaires. It's something else. I mean, I just don't remember what they were called.
Well, anything that brings people together. And speaking of bringing people together, usually on our final section of the podcast, we talk about sport.
Yeah.
We have an amazing tournament bringing people together again this spring. And I think, Anastasia, you're going to be part of it.
Yes.
So what tournament are you joining and what has inspired you to join it?
The Hum Trophy.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is it about? Is it a football trophy? Is it?
You could be a part of it, my friend.
Okay. Well, tell us. Tell us.
Are you
What do
going
you?
to
What?
play? Because I need somebody else to not be as terrible as me.
It's actually a tournament mostly of terrible sports people, if
Staff
I'm
and
honest.
students?
It's staff and students. So staff and students, yeah.
I've talked to several. I didn't get to go last semester, but I've talked to several students that did go, and they were like, "Oh my God, these professors! You would think that they would go easy on us."
Okay.
Let's
continue continue the hard questions. Which position do you play in? And
that's true actually. Which position will you be hoping to play in, Anastasia?
The one that will have the least effect on my team losing. I wouldn't call myself. I've always loved sports, but I think I'm more of a book nerd and researcher.
Really?
But I do enjoy sports.
Okay, you also said you were interested in hockey. So,
Oh,
and we're not talking about field hockey.
I'm a great cheerleader.
Okay.
I'm a great cheerleader, and that's the one place where I still need to go to the Canaries game here in Norwich. Actually, I really want to because
No rush.
I think my partner will have. Stop. I think my partner will be very surprised to see the animalistic side come out. I'm like. Ugh.
Speaking of hockey, again, very momentous week as the Russian-born player Ovechkin has now just equaled the record of the great Wayne Gretzky in hockey. So he scored as many goals. Do you even call them goals in hockey? I'm very ignorant.
I don't think so.
Scores, whatever.
Well, I'm not. I love the way everyone looks at me to answer ice hockey questions. Because do you see any ice out on the UEA Lake?
No, but Ra is the person who knows more ball games and plays more ball games. I mean, you can argue hockey isn't a ball game, but Ra plays cricket, which for me is a total mystery. And he also understands baseball, which, I mean, you might understand baseball.
I watched it in Japan. Loved watching it in Japan because they just have a completely different way of cheering, and I got to sit very close up front.
I was in the US, and everybody was crazy about college basketball while I was there. So are you also part of that craze when? And I was in a pub with a professor, and the screens were all showing Duke playing against Chicago or something, and Duke apparently have a very good basketball team. For me, Duke is like a university which has a press that publishes lots of theoretical stuff. You might have read some of the Duke University Press books. And the professor gave me this whole kind of explanation. He said, we always wait for this. We always bet. Not to earn a lot of money, but it's just kind of a tradition. You get together with your friends, and you always kind of you have two bets. You have a sentimental bet where you always bet for your university alma mater, and on the other hand, you also kind of are very practical and try to win and bet for the best team. And for me, it was like, I mean, basketball is probably the only American sport that I can say I understand, more or less. So
I don't understand.
No,
American
you don't?
football
Okay.
either.
Well, that's fine.
Basketball, I think what I realized is in the U.S., college level sports almost feel like country level sports.
Yeah,
Because
same in
you
Japan.
think
Same
about
in Japan.
Europe,
Japanese
it's
baseball.
smaller countries, so there's a little more pride that you can feel like, even if it's not your alma mater. But I feel like that's why it's so exciting college level, because it's.
But even in that basketball tournament that we were watching, it was so commercialized. Like, so even like during the commercial breaks, clearly these people are students. But on the other hand, they are paid like very good money. They study for free, and each university wants to, just like in the Premier League or in big competitive leagues, when they try to get the best players, they lure these players with offers, and usually they're paid a lot of good money these days.
But I think this is a great example, actually, of the stuff we were talking about earlier, the cultural differences, say, between the United States, where capitalism is sort of celebrated almost as a goal, and somewhere like Japan, where it's not. Because in Japan, college baseball is huge. Well, not actually college baseball, high school baseball.
Even high school baseball,
High school baseball is enormous. But that is not commercialized to the same degree. Koshien is mostly broadcast on NHK, Japanese national television, and you don't have these sponsors. And the reason people love it is because they see these kids and they think they're just playing with their heart for their school, and the school loves them and they're all there celebrating. But it's not about making...
Well, speaking of that, they also, all the American professors told me about Otani. And again, gave me a lecture in baseball, which was very helpful. But they told me how good he was, and how he was a generational player. That we usually use the term for footballers in this country. So I mean, college level, you're right. Like, it's like on national, it becomes like it's elevated to a national level.
And the same will happen at the Hum Trophy.
Everybody will watch the Hum Trophy.
On that note, if you want to hear more from Anastasia, join the Hum Trophy. And we will thank our amazing guest and my co-host, Sherzad.
Thank you both. I think this was a good episode for us, because it is the first one, and hopefully not the last, in which we invite our students and to get a different perspective. Because usually, I mean, for those of you who are listening, just this one, we usually invite scholars and colleagues, but it's also good to have an international perspective from an international student who has this rich experience and very interesting background. So thanks, Anastasia, for being with us today. And thanks, everybody, for listening to this
like
point.
And subscribe.
Please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And until the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.